Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on today's episode is Timothy Zick. He's a professor of law at William and Mary School of Law and the author of a new book called The First Amendment in the Trump Era. We talk today about the many ways in which this president has invoked, in many of our minds, the First Amendment, whether he intended that or not. His attack on his concerted and consistent attack on the press, on the media, and his attacks on dissenters by invoking the very loaded word treason. Tim and I talk not only about what this president has done, but to understand how things are different today and uniquely dangerous today because of the effect throughout our culture, our society, the press, the electorate as a whole. You have to understand something about the ways in which it's different from other points in history when we've confronted questions of the role of the press, the role of free speech, and the role of dissent in our country and in our political conversation. So it's a really great and important discussion on these issues. The book is really, really readable. We'll put a link to it in the description so you can find that. But for now, please listen to and enjoy today's episode. On today's episode, my guest is Timothy Zick. He is the John Marshall Professor of Government and Citizenship at William and Mary Law School and the author of a new book called The First Amendment in the Trump Era. Boy, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to President Trump and the First Amendment. Tim, thank you so much for being on the program. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I know that you have written other books and have focused a lot of your work on the First Amendment. What did you think was important about addressing the First Amendment under President Trump? Why did you, what was the premise of your book?
Yeah, I think I was compelled, I think it's the right way to say it, to write this book in a way that I wouldn't necessarily say for my three other books, which are very different, much more academic in focus and tone and substance. And so, unlike others, I'm a consumer of the news. And so even back, as far as the campaign, the 2016 presidential campaign, then-candidate Trump was saying things that were disturbing. If you follow and support First Amendment norms and rights and principles. So he was, for example, encouraging some of his rally-goers to rough up dissenters and protesters. He was already then talking about opening up the libel laws. It wasn't clear what he meant by that. But he was talking a lot about that. And he even at one point suggested shutting down parts of the Internet to thwart terrorist speech. It's kind of hard to remember that far back. So much has happened since then. So part of what I wanted to do was to chronicle what I thought was, an unusual and unusually perhaps dangerous, set of statements from a candidate who then became president and continued, as you know, sort of speak about not just the libel laws, but the press and dissent and other matters close to my research interests. So I started out writing a book about speech out of doors, so public protest and dissent. And this book connects to that one in a lot of different ways. It connects to my other work, not just my academic work, but I've also testified before a congressional subcommittee about the Occupy Wall Street movement. And so I'm generally interested in issues of protest and dissent. And this president has raised those issues to the fore.
Well, and I've said this numerous times on this podcast. I am a former journalist in my life before law school, so I'm a consumer of the news and someone who cares deeply about the press. And as a historian and someone interested in history and American history, particularly in American constitutional history, I've always thought of the First Amendment as that part of the Constitution that so unique, one of those parts of the Constitution that so uniquely defines our society, our culture, and our democracy, really. I want to, we have talked on this program before about some of the things that you take up in the book, things like hate speech, which has become such an important issue, particularly as it came into focus following the Charlottesville riots, and other aspects of this president, his use of Twitter, for example. We can't miss that. We can't ignore that. But the first two aspects of the First Amendment that you take on in the book and discuss at length are the ones that I think we ought to focus on today, in particular, the president's attacks on the press, on the media, and what you call a free and independent media. And also, as I think most people have heard it called treason, but the law thinks of it in terms of the word sedition. I'd like to talk about those two topics with you today, but before we do, even though I think most people are generally familiar with the First Amendment, I'd really like you to say a few words about the First Amendment and sort of what it is and what it isn't, because I think that it's a concept as well as actual language in our Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. It gets tossed around a lot, but I'm not sure people fully appreciate. I think it would be good for us to start off by clarifying what exactly the First Amendment is and what it isn't, for purposes of then getting into those two big topics.
Yeah, that's obviously a big topic, but an important one. So, of course, the First Amendment is a set of constitutional provisions, right? It's text in the Constitution. Most people, if they can identify anything about the Constitution, they can identify the free speech part of the First Amendment, but of course it contains other rights. It mentions freedom of the press. It mentions assembly, peaceable assembly. It mentions petition. And of course, there are two religion clauses in the First Amendment as well. So it's a text, right? It requires interpretation to give it meaning. And the First Amendment, like other constitutional provisions, has changed meaning over time through judicial interpretation, of course, but through cultural change, political and social change as well. It's developed into a line of precedents, but also a set of norms and principles. And it's become part of our constitutional culture in that sense. It's interesting, and I don't think most people do realize this, if you just focus in on the press part of it. The Supreme Court has never read the press provision, the press clause, as having really any independent significance, independent of freedom of speech. So when people invoke the press clause, and the media often like to invoke it, well, of course, there's a press clause, and that must have some meaning. It does, but I don't think it has the specific, robust meaning that people often want to attribute to it. For the most part, the press, in terms of their news gathering and access to information, has the same rights that any citizen would have. So there's no special right of access in the constitutional sense. There's no privilege in the constitutional sense to resist governmental demands for information. That might surprise some people as well. Most of what the press has its rights are really not rights, but matters of grace. The government allows for press passes. It allows access to, public events or processes or institutions. So I think that would probably surprise a lot of people. Notwithstanding that, we do have a robust and independent press, but it's less a product of constitutional interpretation, Supreme Court interpretation in particular, and much more a part of sort of the fabric of what Americans understand to be a free press principle and a set of free press norms.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, the First Amendment is understood as carving out rights, individual rights, that the government ought to protect by not passing laws that would infringe on those rights. And actually,
Right.
The language of the First Amendment starts out that way: Congress shall not. Which I guess raises another question here, because we're focusing on the President of the United States, not Congress. And so much of what we think about when we think about this president is not even so much his policies or initiatives, but the person himself, his words, his tweets, his statements at his public rallies. What about that characteristic of this president and this presidency and this time that we're living in, do you think changes the way we think about the time we're living in? And you called it a dangerous time in terms of the First Amendment.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. One is a textual point that you made, right? It says Congress shall make no law. Does that mean that the president is free to conduct himself in any manner he wishes with regard to the speech rights of citizens? And the answer to that is no, at least according to the courts that have taken up that issue, including, you mentioned the Twitter case, right? The president there is sued for blocking his critics on Twitter, and the Second Circuit concludes that that's a First Amendment violation. That's sort of consistent with the judicial understanding. There are scholars who take issue with that, right? Congress should mean Congress. It doesn't mean the president. It doesn't mean the judiciary. But it's generally understood that the president is constrained by the First Amendment. Now, when the president tweets, if that's all he's doing, when he weighs in on controversies of the day or starts controversies himself,
Right.
He's engaged in speech. He's a government official, but he's also an individual. And I have to draw very early in the book this line between the government or government officials as speakers, right, themselves, right, individually, and governments as regulators, right? To the extent the president goes beyond just weighing in and speaking, to the extent he uses his powers to coerce a member of the press or anybody else, then the First Amendment constrains him. And a lot of what the president has done is sort of, step up to that line in many cases, but not necessarily step over it. So what's the concern there? Well, who cares if the president's not violating someone's First Amendment rights? Well, the reason to care about what the president is doing is that he can do a lot of damage in terms of undermining the press as an institution and reporters individually, simply by carrying out a vicious, public, continuous, what's been called a war on the press. And the president, this president, no president likes criticism, right? Since Washington, presidents have chafed at criticism by the press. What's distinctive about the Trump era is the sort of publicness, the transparency of his agenda. He actually told a reporter during an interview that I'm doing this, I'm taking issue with the press, I'm waging war on the press so that its credibility is destroyed. And that is unique. Presidents from Washington forward, they'd complain about the press, and they'd usually do that in private correspondence, but never before have we had this sort of public continual attack on a free and independent press. And that is dangerous. Whether or not a reporter gets jailed for what he or she prints or publishes, the norms and principles are under attack. The normalization of that treatment of the press as an institution and individual reporters is a danger, a First Amendment danger. Today, I think, marks the 301st day without a press conference. And think what you will about the sort of sometimes kabuki theater of press conferences, but they are one way in which the public gets to see the government being held accountable. And that's missing. So there's a norm that's sort of dropped out, and that's just one of many.
Well, right. I mean, he's really changed the relationship between the president and the press and between the president and the public in pretty dramatic ways. As you point out, Washington, all the way back to Washington, presidents have chafed at criticism in the press. But of course, 200 plus years ago, you had to wait for a copy of the local newspaper to arrive by horseback. And it might be 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 months after that article appeared. Now, he pushes a button on his phone or computer, and 65 million people who follow his Twitter account, hear what he has to say, or you're watching it in real time on your television or on your laptop. So it's dramatically different. And he doesn't perhaps hold press conferences, but he'll bark at a line of reporters before he gets on a helicopter or in the car to go somewhere, or he holds a rally that gets covered in part or entirely, depending on which network you're watching, and says all kinds of things. So here, as you point out, there's a difference between government or a government official as a speaker and a government official as a regulator, but there does seem to be this vast gray area in the middle where he is influencing through his speech in all kinds of ways with his choice of language and tone and the subject matter, all kinds of values that are implicated in the First Amendment.
Yeah, and these are all because the nature of Twitter, very public controversies, and so the public can see them, develop in real time. For example, the sort of long-standing spat with the NFL players who kneeled during the national anthem. Now, the president never officially used the levers of power to get those players fired, but he certainly advocated for that. He certainly suggested that the NFL's antitrust exemption might be looked at. It's a classic sort of Trumpian way of veiled threat to critics. And he said similar things about Google, about cable media, even about Saturday Night Live. They should all be investigated. Well, why should they be investigated? Because they don't cover me in a positive way, or they make fun of me. To the extent he's going beyond that and using something like the postal laws or the antitrust laws to punish Jeff Bezos because the Washington Post criticizes Trump in some of its coverage, then we have a constitutional problem. We have a First Amendment violation, in fact. But as I said, most of what the president does is sort of wear down his critics with this constant barrage of tweets. And the terminology that he's using is also unusual. So the enemy of the American people, referring to the press that way, whether at a live rally or in a tweet, suggests something. What does it suggest? It suggests these are your enemies. You should do them harm. It's a dangerous way to sort of rile up the base, to not just boo the press, but perhaps even physically assault them. We've had newsrooms that have been shot up by people who parrot the same sort of language, which isn't to say the president is directly responsible for their death, but we shouldn't normalize any of this. We shouldn't just laugh it off as a tweet when it comes with language like that, or calling individual reporters disgusting, horrible, scum, and revoking press credentials, seemingly again because reporters are critical in their coverage or ask questions that the president does not like. And one thing we haven't yet touched on, is an important part of this, of course, is the co-opting of the phrase fake news.
Yeah.
Which is now anything seemingly that's critical of the president. So he characterizes real events as fake and fake events as the truth. We really have not just a war on the press, but a war on dissent and a war on truth itself.
Absolutely. And I was going to really zero in on those two phrases, enemy of the people and fake news, when it comes to the press and the independence of the press and the rights and importance of a free and independent press in our society. The fake news is I find particularly disturbing, because this is also a president who I think even many of his staunchest supporters would have to admit, if they were being honest, this is a president who engages in fake news all the time, almost every day, in fact. But if you've got a platform, if you have the pulpit, the bully pulpit of the presidency, and 65 million Twitter followers, and you say something loudly enough and brashly enough and often enough, people will react to that and will believe it or will act on it, as in the NFL case that you mentioned earlier. There's a notion in the constitutional and judicial interpretation of the First Amendment that we often see in cases, the chilling effect when it comes to the First Amendment. Do you think that even though the president isn't going perhaps over that line, as you say, to actually push for new laws in libel law, for example, or actually direct the antitrust division of the Justice Department to start investigating the NFL over its antitrust exemption, even though he doesn't go that far, is there a chilling effect that we should be concerned about, given his speech and the nature of his speech and the platforms that he has available to him?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So in the scholarly world, this notion of chilling effect, so you're not actually prosecuted for something or you're not jailed for something, but you're reticent to speak out because you might be, right? There's this sort of sword hanging over you that causes you to sort of trim your sails and be careful of what you say. And there's some scholarship questioning whether that's a real phenomenon. It's very difficult to measure, to objectify, but one can well imagine, certainly in these contexts, that it's real in the sense that, does the press bend over backwards to be fair so that it doesn't get this kind of blowback or pushback or criticism from the president? Does it actually treat things as true that are false, or at least treat them seriously just so that they're not subject to this criticism? That might be one form of sort of affecting coverage. Chill, in a more general sense, could affect any number of different critics or dissenters. I mean, you don't see NFL players taking a knee anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's because the protest point has been made, or maybe it's because, their bosses let them know that the policy was going to be different. If they wanted to do that, they shouldn't do it in public. But that controversy seems to have ended in a way that the president probably very much likes. You take press credentials away. You heap criticism on your critics through Twitter. It may well have that kind of chilling effect. It can change coverage. It can change, what is said about you. And on the flip side, it can embolden certain speakers, right? So there's been sort of this notion of a rise in hate speech during this presidency. Well, that, of course, has an effect on people who are targeted by that speech. It makes it less comfortable for them to speak out, whether it's online or at a public protest. So I think that is one of the things that is built into the way the president conducts himself, the way he speaks or speaks out. And it's one concern, I think, among many.
So one of the things that I think is so interesting and helpful about your book is that, I think a lot of people believe, because we live in the time we live in, that Trump is unique, is a unique presidential phenomenon. But actually, in all of the areas covered in your book, and we're now talking about a war on the press, on the media in particular right now, he's not. It's not as if there is no precedent for this, and I'm thinking particularly one of the best examples of this is President Nixon, who famously or infamously had an enemies list that included many members of the news media at the time, who also famously banned the Washington Post from the White House because he didn't like the coverage of Watergate. So taking this topic that we're working through now, a president going to war or really going after the press more than just being disgruntled over a particular news article or television piece. What do you think is and isn't new and different or more than about what we see under this president compared to what we've seen under previous administrations?
Yeah, the original title for my book, the one I proposed when I submitted the manuscript, was The First Amendment Lessons of the Trump Era. I'm happy with the title as is, but what I was trying to get at in writing about this era was a comparison between this one and others to try and find out exactly what you just asked. What's distinctive about the Trump era? I mean, we've always had presidents who disliked press criticism. We've even had presidents like Adams who jailed their critics under the Sedition Act of 1798, which essentially criminalized criticizing the government. Woodrow Wilson attacked the press and attacked critics and conducted a war on dissent. Nixon, as you mentioned, had his enemies list. I mean, you could cite FDR and JFK. Even President Obama, right, was criticized for going after reporters to try and get at their confidential sources in national security cases. So every president chafes at criticism. They all challenge the First Amendment in certain ways. And in that sense, Trump just follows suit, right? He's just one of many presidents, pretty much all presidents, who've had a complicated relationship with the press. One of the things that Trump can do, and you alluded to this earlier, that others couldn't, is to wholly bypass the press. So FDR had fireside chats, and of course JFK had television, and you could speak to the people directly, but not every day, not every minute, not in the way that Trump can through Twitter. So he becomes a much more constant presence in the daily lives of Americans, and he has then a platform for challenging and attacking his critics in real time, or sometimes even preemptively. So that's very different.
He can create, and also, as you pointed out, he can create news. I mean, you had presidents who would make announcements on important developments, but, it's often said that President Trump is quite masterful at controlling the so-called news cycle, because at any moment he can blast out several tweets and dominate the headlines for that day. That's something pretty unique, I think, in the way he communicates.
It is unique. And, part of the problem there, he's either a master manipulator or the media is being suckered. It's too easy to get them to chase tweets because outrage increases eyeballs and revenues. And so, newscasts will, or segments hearings will be just about dissecting the tweet the president sent out a few minutes ago, which does drive, what's still called the news cycle. I'm not even sure there is one
right.
Anymore, as we used to understand that. But so that, unique and powerful in the sense that he has this tool of communication and takes advantage of it. It's the sort of public transparency of it, the normalization or the attempt to normalize running down the press and destroying its credibility. That's really probably the most unique thing about the Trump era, as I call it. So I don't think we should judge the president by, 18th century standards, whether or not the press is being jailed or not. So in the contemporary era, no president has taken on the press and waged war on it like Trump has, and sort of admitted that or conceded that in public. And it's having some effect. I mean, if you look at poll numbers, the number of people who think that the government should have more control over the press is increasing. That number is going up. And the press's credibility is going down, right? It's at record low levels. The president's is low too, but it's having this damaging effect so that, people say, well, that may be what the New York Times or Washington Post reports, but that's fake. There's no objective baseline of truth. One of the president's advisors, I think it was Rudy Giuliani, said facts aren't facts. Or
Kellyanne Conway. Kellyanne, alternate facts.
Right. I remember that one too, right? So there's something to this sort of a constant campaign that is unique, that is different, and it almost makes you lose sight of the more serious things that are going on with respect to free speech and press. So one of the things that I didn't get a chance to write about in the book that I think relates back to free press is the indictment of Julian Assange. Assange, of course, is the founder of WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks has been involved in some very big public controversies in our domestic politics recently. But what he's being indicted for, Assange, in this case, is hacking into or helping to hack into diplomatic cables that were both embarrassing and potentially dangerous, but also publishing that information. Now, with respect to the First Amendment doesn't have anything to say about conduct like hacking computer files. You have no First Amendment defense there. But the second part of that, the superseding indictment, the later indictment of Assange just for publishing, is a potentially very dangerous precedent in the making if we ever get our hands on him and prosecute him, because it's very difficult to say, well, if Assange can be prosecuted for that, why can't the Post? And why can't the New York Times?
Well, I thought that issue was settled, Tim, in the Pentagon Papers case, where Daniel Ellsberg was prosecuted, ultimately, I think, unsuccessfully, for the crime of releasing the information, but the New York Times was vindicated, ultimately, for publishing that information.
Yeah, you couldn't impose a prior restraint on the press, but the provision of the Espionage Act that the government is now invoking, I think, has not been definitively interpreted. So whether or not you can, in fact, prosecute someone simply for publishing truthful information, there are precedents that say you cannot. Right? There are First Amendment precedents that would support the view, the position, that a person who lawfully obtains, if that's what he did, truthful information and then publishes it, if it's on a matter of public concern, and this clearly would have a First Amendment defense. So I think the government may be trying to challenge that principle, or at least to distinguish it in the case of Assange. All of that, assumes that he could take advantage of a First Amendment defense. Of course, he's not a U.S. citizen, and he didn't act on U.S. soil when he did these things. So.
And we have a different Supreme Court today. We have a different Supreme Court than we had when the Pentagon Papers case was heard.
Certainly do.
So, this Supreme Court might take a more pro-executive branch, pro-regulatory stance when it comes to the press and the First Amendment.
It absolutely might. So while all these other things are circulating in the news, you've got this very serious potential threat to the press that's sitting out there. And then, even the president's effort to out the whistleblower in the Ukraine impeachment case implicates First Amendment rights in terms of anonymity and the importance of that to whistleblower protections and free speech as well. So there's some very serious matters that seem to be on the periphery as we all sort of chase the president's most recent outrageous statement or outrageous gambit with regard to the press. So recently his lawyers sent a letter to CNN threatening to sue them for false advertising. What in the world is he talking about?
Yeah.
It's their political coverage that he objects to.
Right.
So,
he does seem to make things up sometimes too. I mean,
indeed, right?
Yeah.
Yes, but he's got lawyers who are willing to sort of present these theories at least. And I think CNN's lawyers look at that and say, well, that's not a serious threat to us. That's just the president sort of speaking to his base and fighting the media, and that's a good political position to be in.
Well, I do want to spend some time talking about treason and sedition, but before we move to that, one thing I'm wondering, and I know the focus of your book and the focus of our conversation so far has been on President Trump, who does have the loudest voice and the most Twitter followers and has used them to great effect and raised many serious concerns. But one of the downstream consequences of this, I wonder, is that it's not any longer something that we can attribute uniquely to him, because politicians and others, but here we're really talking about government officials, we already know that there are leaders in other countries who've picked up on President Trump's lead and have started talking about fake news in their own countries. But also, I'm thinking we don't know what will happen in 2020. It could be President Trump winning re-election. It could be another Republican if he's actually removed from office, or it could be one of the Democrats. But any of them, and maybe all of them to varying degrees, can employ, and some would say already employ, similar tactics in their speech, in their language, in the use of Twitter and other social media platforms. The truth, one could say, is being eroded by many people downstream of President Trump, so to speak. I mean, how concerned are you about that? That this problem, that these erosions of the First Amendment values in our country could continue well beyond the presidency of Donald Trump?
Yeah, it's sort of a painful irony. We may be exporting something like this as opposed to the sort of freedom and independent press principles that I think our nation was founded upon. So there's sort of a painful irony to that, and that's a concern. Domestically, both at the top in terms of political leaders and with respect to the people themselves, this war on the press and war on dissent, as I call it in the book, is having an effect both on how political leaders interact with the press, and I'm thinking not just of Republicans, some Democrats
absolutely
are going to realize this is a very effective argument. Right? If you don't like the reporting, then you suggest that there's bias, and you attack the press. So one of the Democratic presidential contenders, Tulsi Gabbard, has sued Google for its coverage, for its algorithm. I mean, Google's not bound by the First Amendment, and surely she must know that. So it's a very Trumpian move to sort of even file the lawsuit. But I think if this program, if this agenda works for a political official, I would not be surprised to see it used, maybe not to the same degree and extent, by other political leaders. We've seen that in Kentucky, right? The recently defeated governor there was very Trumpian in the way that he conducted himself. I think this is going to be a long-standing problem for the body politic. And with regard to the rest of us, the way that the people interact, try having a conversation with someone who thinks facts aren't facts.
Yeah.
To the extent that's a real arguing position, you find it difficult to have a conversation with people. So I think this is not just Trump. People say, well, is he the condition? Is he the symptom? There were a lot of pre-existing conditions that led us to the Trump era. And those included the media's financial struggles and their fracturing, and digitized speech, and the changed relationships already between reporters and officials, depressed judicial support for press rights. We haven't had a free speech or press case in the Supreme Court for decades.
Yeah. Well, and the nature of the press itself. I mean, when the First Amendment was written, the idea of the press, I mean, that's an important choice of words there, because it actually was a printing press, often in the back room of some small shop, like in Peter Zenger's shop in New York. I mean, and then we have these big media companies that we know today, but at the same time, Trump is coming to the political forefront. We also have, it seems, a return to the early days of the press, where it's no longer a printing press. It's a laptop and an internet connection. And not only the calling out of fake press, but almost the celebrating of, fake news. Not only the calling out of fake news, but the celebrating of fake news by anybody in a basement with an internet connection, can start making money as a so-called news media content creator. I mean, the truth is really hard to find these days.
Yeah, it's sort of up for grabs. I don't get into this in detail in the book, but of course there are challenges of disinformation in the digital space, deep fakes. The challenges there are going to exacerbate the problem of fake news as it's been co-opted, and the sort of war on truth as it's been executed. So digital space, and Trump occupies that in a unique way, I think we can see is going to pose really serious and distinctive problems for our politics and for our political culture.
Well, let's get into this a little bit as we wind down, because this is another really important subject that you take on in your book. It's been really, I think, a black mark on our politics and our society at points throughout our country's history, as I think it is again, as Trump uses the word treason in a way I don't think we have heard since the McCarthy era, since the Red Scare. It does have some precedent going all the way back to the beginnings of our country, and you talk about this in the Adams administration and during World War I and even during World War II. And frankly, probably everybody's favorite president, Lincoln, cracked down on dissenters during the Civil War. So, during times of war, we've seen this in our country, cracking down on speech as being seditious or treasonous. But we're not at war now, and yet we see this return to the language of wartime and treasonous speech in a way I don't know that we've ever seen. You talk about that a bit. How do you see Trump's use of the word treason to describe often people who simply disagree with him or are willing to speak against him or testify against him in a hearing like the impeachment hearings, as being different from other points in our history where we've seen this type of talk?
Yeah, it is an unfortunate part of our history that you see charges of treason connected to what's otherwise just disagreement with your government's policies. And those, of course, include policies with respect to war and international conflict. And one of the things that's unique about the Trump era, at least up until the last couple of days, it's been a time of relative peace. And so, as distressing as it is that we've had sort of a crackdown on criticism and dissent during wartime, and Jeff Stone at Chicago has written a wonderful book about that history, here we've had an era of relative peace, or mostly peace, and yet you still hear charges of treason. So, with respect to the person who claims to have worked in the administration and wrote an anonymous op-ed criticizing the president, now has a book out, still anonymously, that person is committing treason. Well, of course they're not. If you know anything about the crime of treason, giving aid to the enemy, it doesn't come close to being treasonous. But to label it so suggests something, again, on the order of enemy of the American people. If you're a critic of the government, you're engaged in some kind of disloyal, unpatriotic exercise. And one of the things about President Trump is that he often falsely equates loyalty to the country with loyalty to himself as a person. So anyone who's disloyal to or critical of the president is automatically then against the United States and not a patriot. So it's creating this sort of environment in which critics of government themselves aren't patriots, they're enemies of the state. And that, of course, has it exactly backwards. I mean, dissenters from the beginning have been among the greatest patriots from the Boston Tea Party forward.
Right. We are a country built on dissent, founded in dissent.
Of course.
So,
yeah. Right. And he either doesn't understand that, which wouldn't surprise me, or understands it, but, out of partisan political motivations, is trying to change the nature of that conversation in the same way he's trying to co-opt fake news. And again, he wouldn't be the first president to suggest that critics of government policies are not patriotic. We've had lots of presidents who did that. But I don't know that it's a loyalty to the U.S. he's talking about. I think it's a loyalty to the president and the person of Donald Trump.
See, I think President Trump does know. I mean, I'm not saying he's necessarily the brightest or but I think he does know. I mean, in other times, we can differentiate times of war, and we can look at those critically in hindsight. But those were times of war. Other presidents in relative peacetime, Nixon is again the obvious example. I mean, he had an enemies list. He turned the IRS loose on some of his critics, but he wasn't doing it. And I'm not defending it or rationalizing it, but he didn't do it so openly and so brazenly to affect public opinion and public thinking and changes in the way our society and our culture is shaped. I think he does it very consciously. He uses the word treason, I believe, with deliberateness, just as he uses the word enemy of the people. There isn't anybody at his level who would fail to appreciate the historical significance of those words. And I think that's what's so dangerous. It's with intention. I don't know what we do about that.
Right.
But that's what I think is so troubling.
He does seem to have sort of this nostalgia for an era in which, protesters were roughed up, beaten, and police officers didn't treat protesters nicely. And I think that extends to, you may be right. His use of the word treason or enemies of the American people, I don't think he's widely read by any means, but I think, you may be right that he understands, at least to the extent, of an agenda, right? How can I flip this language or co-opt this language to my benefit? And the danger, of course, is, suggesting that, someone has committed treason means that they should be punished by death. And, there's a sort of physicality to this language. It's not just that you should, turn away from or disagree with this person. It's that you should do something more than that, that they're a danger to your country. They're coming for you. The press is after you. And because they're after me, by definition, they're after my supporters. And so turn around and boo the press at my rallies. Don't be nice to these dissenting protesters. They don't deserve, nice treatment. They deserve to be roughed up. And treason is just part of that agenda. I think if you asked him what the crime of treason is, he would not know.
Yeah, I agree.
Do believe that.
Yeah,
but language is powerful.
Well, right. He may not be scholarly either in law or history, but he was a student of Roy Cohn. He did use the courts and his legal team to sue anybody who crossed his path, whether it was a contractor and working in one of his hotels or somebody who alleged, probably correctly, that he'd had an affair with them, and we get these legal agreements to hush them up. I mean, he's used language and language about the law, even if not truly educated in the law, but he's used it with a clenched fist, throughout his business career and now in politics. And that's why I say I think it's with intention. I don't think he could give you the elements of treason either, but he knows the power of that word.
Yeah, and the same is true of the press. Right before he was president, right, he's a real estate developer and a celebrity of sorts, and he manipulated the press in both of those capacities. And whether successfully or not, I think his relationship with the press has always been manipulative, and nothing changed when he was sworn in as president of the United States. The stakes got a lot higher for us as a country. And so that's why I think we should not, again, turn away or laugh at or normalize even the language of treason or enemy of the American people. We should be very concerned about that language, as I write in the book.
Well, and I'm now thinking, what do we do about the condition we find ourselves in? And I can think of at least two things that people can do. Three things. Actually, first of all, you should read your book, because this is really important to understand and understand the history and understand the kinds of things we're talking about, how things are different today. Secondly, obviously, I think people can vote their values, and this should be the kind of thing in people's minds when they think about not only this president, whether he should be reelected, but what kind of candidate you would support. What is their attitude toward these values, towards truth, towards free and independent press, and so on. And third, I think it, for me, emphasizes again the importance of our judiciary. What kind of judges are our presidents appointing to the bench and all the way up to the Supreme Court, because it's in the courts ultimately where these rights will be vindicated or not, or limited in some important ways. And as you say, we haven't seen a lot of First Amendment cases in the courts apart from the religion clauses of the First Amendment. So when those cases eventually do present to the court, you hope that the court will be a backstop in continuing to protect these rights, even if elected officials don't. What do you think about that? And is there anything else that people should be thinking about besides those points?
I think it's pretty common for Americans to sort of look to the courts first to protect them, and so far the courts have done well, in my view. So there's the Twitter case in the Second Circuit. I think that was the right result to stop the president from blocking his critics on an official platform, essentially treated as official just because they're critics. There are two press cases involving credentials where district courts have, under the Due Process Clause, rejected the government's pulling of press credentials. They didn't reach the First Amendment issues in those cases, but they thwarted the government's effort to sort of stop reporters from showing up with their credentials. But I think a large part of the damage here is not fixable, may not even present to the courts, including the Supreme Court. There may be some big precedents, maybe the Assange case or something like that. But most of this damage is cultural and political. And how do you fix that? A really complicated set of issues. Just a couple of quick thoughts on that. One, I think, and I don't spare the press criticism in the book, I think the press needs to change how it covers presidential candidates and maybe politics more generally. If the model is going to be a president tweets and the media just follows, we're going to be stuck in this cycle for a very long time. So there has to be a reckoning there. One of the great ironies of the Trump presidency is how many millions of dollars in free coverage he got from the media, who he now attacks as his enemy and the enemy of the American people. Right. So smarter journalism, and that's difficult because of the financial challenges, digitization, and all of that. And then smarter consumption. We are literally teaching young students how to read the news. And I think that's a very good thing. It's a stunning thing in some ways. But I think you have to be a smart and savvy and somewhat skeptical consumer of news. You cannot get your news solely from a Facebook feed. You're going to have to put in more effort than that. Otherwise, the truth will be whatever the government tells you it is. And that's a place we do not want to find ourselves.
Right. Love it. Good stuff. Tim, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. Timothy Zick is the author of The First Amendment in the Trump Era, published by Oxford. It's a very readable read. We'll put a link in the description for the episode so that people can click on it and get a copy of the book. I think this is the kind of book that everybody should read to become more knowledgeable about these issues. And as you say, to become more knowledgeable consumers of news and information. So I appreciate the book very much and appreciate your time talking with us on the podcast.
Thanks again for having me on. I enjoyed it.